at ITP, a colleague of mine, and many of you will know him from other activities in the platform. Stuart is an urban mobility specialist with a master's in transport and city planning. He has 12 years of experience across urban mobility and international development. Stuart is currently leading the development of a national e-mobility roadmap for Mongolia, and he has undertaken similar e-mobility studies for public transport in the Philippines and Almaty in Kazakhstan. So in this webinar, Stuart will explore the power of e-mobility roadmaps to set the direction for national EV transition. And this webinar will provide an overview of the roadmap development process from initiation to implementation. So without further ado, Stuart, I'll hand over to you and allow you to take us through your presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Ji-Woon, for the introduction. Just one moment while I bring up today's presentation. And it should now be visible. Oh. Apologies. Okay. Great. So today I am going to provide an overview really to the e-mobility development process and some of the key factors to consider in them, and an overview of why we produce roadmaps and what they're there to address. So as a starting point, so the EV transition as I think all of us here will understand, is a multifaceted challenge. So it's cross sectors, so it interacts with a wide range of different interests and priorities, both in the public and the private sector. It contributes and occasionally competes with other national and subnational policy agendas, and indeed international ones. And it also may require of policymakers innovative forms of action in order to overcome the practical challenges to deliver them in a way which perhaps our public sectors are not traditionally designed to facilitate. So it requires that innovation and some of the deeper changes as well. So if we look at the sort of the tangle of issues to overcome in terms of those stakeholders, agendas, and practical challenges, what we end up with is something not unlike this, which is actually a huge amount of overlapping and often quite complex challenges. They're multidisciplinary, so they range all the way from energy to industrial development, and they involve sort of complex challenges around, for example, market creation and shaping. Require reforms of some of our business models for the way things are currently done, and they sort of touch on things like governance and institutions as well. So it's often challenging when we're looking at sort of promotion of e-mobility and EV deployment to know really where to start. So what's the starting point and what's the process through which we start to tackle some of these issues, and we start to organize them into a way whereby we have an orderly, targeted, and sort of objective-led transition towards e-mobility and EVs, which brings on the different stakeholders that are needed and doesn't get stuck with bottlenecks along the way. So the EV roadmap process, or EV roadmaps as a tool, are basically there to help us to untangle some of those issues by helping us to understand the potential for e-mobility in the broadest of senses, and then to develop a vision and to set a vision and an implementation plan for how we're going to catalyze them, ultimately leading us to a targeted plan of action and the ability to convince and to build a case to stakeholders, build a case to the wider community for action in a way which is based on evidence and it's based on objectives. So it's a methodology. Fundamentally, it helps us to think about objective actions. It's flexible and adaptable. So at the highest of levels, it could be for an emerging context, so sort of starting from a very early stage of EV readiness and EV deployment. That could be at a national level, so looking at actually what are the opportunities on the whole national level for e-mobility, right the way down to a city level or down to a subsector. So it might be public transport or a particular mode, freight, for example. It's also it's widely used in global, developed and emerging market contexts. So there's lots of China, for example, most developed EV market globally, has an EV roadmap, and that goes right the way through in developed and emerging contexts. So in the next slides, really, I'm just going to talk through what that process looks like, give some tips in terms of what the different factors and variables might be, or things to consider as you develop a roadmap, and really give an overview as to sort of what a roadmap looks like and what that process is to help us assess the suitability of them for countries in the region as part of their deployment of e-mobility and the funding, financing, and the reforms required. So starting at point 1, so we're looking at understanding the potential for e-mobility. So here, this is, I think, the thing to really focus on here is actually starting that from the basis of an exploratory assessment and of the importance of in-country engagement to be able to understand the potential, to understand the context, to understand the policy agendas, to understand the stakeholders, and the existing ecosystem for e-mobility. So I think that the breadth of e-mobility means that actually some policy agendas, some stakeholders will come to the surface as being either the most relevant, most engaged, or those really important bottlenecks that might come up. They might come up in the energy sector, they might come up, for example, in the public transport sector, it might be industrial development, but really kind of get onto the ground and sort of understand, get the feel of what's happening on the ground. Speak to existing ecosystem stakeholders, understand what their perspectives have been as pathfinders, really, in the e-mobility industry. What has their experience been in deploying and expanding e-mobility? What have the bottlenecks been? What are the opportunities? How are they promoting e-mobility in the market? That again provides real-world experience that goes far beyond often what data can provide us with in framing the scene. Then the data analysis is, however, important. So that's taking away those key agendas. It's looking at, for example, total cost of ownership for different segments to understand which are more or less competitive, and overall how competitive the market is in general for e-mobility in that country, that city. Looking at things like energy prices, which will have a big bearing on it, or sort of import tariffs and sort of tariff regimes, for example. Look at economic incentive structures generally that are there for e-mobility, and then also looking at the impacts on the energy side for the energy grid, and also the GHG mitigation impacts, which will vary quite greatly depending on the energy mix. Those are just a sample of things really to analyse. A lot of that, again, will come out in the assessment. From that assessment, we'll also start to understand what might drive support for e-mobility, or what policy agendas can e-mobility really contribute to in country or in the city. Obviously, as practitioners, we often think of GHG mitigation as being, and decarbonisation as is the policy agenda we're coming at this from. It rarely stops at decarbonisation. So things like industrial development, things like air pollution in a city level, sustainable urban mobility, jobs, and local manufacturing, for example, are other big drivers which can often build local support for EVs more perhaps than the GHG mitigation impacts. Understanding those policy drivers also helps us then sort of think about what is the scope of the possible, and what are the bottlenecks to reaching that potential. So that involves taking a detailed look at the existing regulation and standards, looking at the policy and strategy of different sectors, so transport, energy, industrial development, environment, sort of across government, and then understanding the institutional barriers and governance barriers that might exist also to e-mobility deployment, again coming from that initial in-country engagement. So having that understanding the potential provides the initial overview. I think once that you've done that, we move on to vision building. So what we're looking at here is trying to take all of that data, and it's often an iterative process, but to try and understand what is the possibility space for e-mobility in the short, medium, and sort of long term. So what are the objectives that we think e-mobility can contribute to? So why are we implementing e-mobility? Again, GHG mitigation is a big part of that, but what are the other factors which will encourage policymakers, encourage operators and industry to move in that direction? Which vehicle segments do we want to prioritize? It might be that there's that within those objectives, certain vehicle segments work best. What is the readiness of those segments for e-mobility? So might be driven by industrial development. So for example, in the Philippines, the jeepney sector is a key sector for industry, and that therefore makes it a high priority for certain e-mobility objectives developing them there. What's holding these segments back now? In order to be able to propose actions and solutions, it's important to understand the dynamics of those vehicle segments and to understand what is necessary to move them forward. Maybe fiscal incentives, it's probably equally as likely to be bound in regulatory or policy issues or other areas in which we can make nudges towards e-mobility. And then finally, it's taking a stock of what is the appetite of stakeholders to support these. So we can develop a vision, but when we're trying to coordinate across policy areas in government, it's important for us to understand what the appetite is of those different stakeholders to make the changes necessary in order to catalyze that market. So taking a view on that. The idea is that the vision is something which can be bought into by all of the stakeholders that are needed to actually make the changes, to actually promote those targets. So it's important that we have that buy-in to the vision and that it's produced in a collaborative way and with consultation. So then we move into, once we've got a vision, then we can start looking at scenarios. So we understand what our priorities are, we understand what our targets are. Once we translate that into numbers, so we translate that into targets in the short, medium, and long term, we can then start to understand actually what are the impacts of that and the benefits of that over time. So that includes consideration for things like additional investment needs, so thinking about charging infrastructure, thinking about business models, thinking about the different fiscal and non-fiscal incentives. We can also understand what that will do to energy consumption, and you can see on the sort of the bottom right there, sort of what that might have done based on models that we've done elsewhere to petrol consumption over time. That enables us to model the net fiscal impact of the transition. So looking at the cost of the incentives, but also what that will do to tax revenues, for example, from capital and operating costs of EVs and fuel consumption and that sort of thing, as well as the benefits modelling. So looking at what it will do over time to GHG emissions, looking at air pollution, that can be extrapolated to health benefits. There may be others, industrial development benefits. So there's sort of the GDP impacts of that, or the fiscal, the net financial impact of that as well. Scenario building, we need to look at delivering an iterative process here, really. Rarely are we going to get it right the first time in terms of aligning those targets with the impacts and with the cost of that. So again, that's something best done as part of a process involving the different stakeholders from across government and across also industry, if we have an existing ecosystem there. Yeah, I mean, action planning then becomes a case of understanding who will own the roadmap and coordinate it. That can look different in different countries. It can look different depending on what the principal motivation for e-mobility is. Many countries, so thinking about, for example, in India, in the Philippines with the CREVI, that roadmap might actually be owned by the Department for Industry or ministries for industry. Other countries where energy is kind of the key constraining factor or the key policy agenda. It might be the Department for Industry, Environment, Transport. Also will play a role, and in certain cases may be the ones that are driving the actions that need to be taken in the overall roadmap direction. Within that, there's roles and responsibilities for those different measures. And those, we can see some of those roles, responsibilities, and sort of short, medium, and long-term actions to the right there. I think often a key sort of grounding factor to the e-mobility roadmap, and what's often a sense check to that, is then also to develop the understanding of the fiscal implications of the roadmap and how that will be that can be funded or financed, looking at the different stakeholders that will own those impacts. It may be that, for example, the benefits may often occur in terms of, for example, sort of environment, GHG mitigation. They may occur to different policy areas, but actually the costs align elsewhere, for example, with public transport authorities or into industry. So it's important to understand across government, across policy areas, what the balance of that financing is and who will own those fiscal implications. On a more positive note, also there's the opportunity to look at what the different financing options and sources might be for the key investments and market segments we're going to prioritise, be that looking at charging infrastructure, be that looking at, for example, renewable energy generation or that's linked to EV deployment, or indeed fleets of vehicles themselves. What are the different financing options? That could include climate finance. That could also that often will include the overall budget for renewal of fleet and other areas. Often it might be financing as much as funding that is what's required. So looking also at how government can play a role in concessional financing. Within that, there's a key factor will be the looking at the ability of the public sector or others to be able to deliver some of these in cases where there is restrictions on, for example, financing for perhaps buses, which are a private sector fleet, looking at how the regulation allows that as well. So the financing part is a list of different options, but it's also a deeper piece which requires thought to how to align funding to opportunities. So the final thing really in the process is the engagement, visibility, and advocacy, and maybe that's the wrong way of framing it, because I think one of the key learnings that we've had has been that actually the engagement process throughout and the facilitation of that discussion among the stakeholders is almost as important as the actual output itself. So the purpose of the roadmap is really to bring together the different stakeholders, the different policy areas, into a conversation to understand what the common challenges and opportunities are, and to begin those conversations about how we can jointly plan the transition of e-mobility and set targets which meet the needs of all of the different affected parties. Also, there's an extent to which the roadmap process is also about providing visible momentum to the e-mobility ecosystem more generally around the direction of travel for e-mobility in a particular country or city. So to provide that confidence and to provide that assurance that there is a credible transition happening. Again, that external engagement, visibility, and advocacy is part of the process and not something which is just to be done right at the end. Taking the stakeholders on that journey is also important to identify champions for the roadmap after the development of it. So who are the people who will sustain that momentum, that visibility, and to advocate for EVs beyond the duration of the study itself. Conscious of time, and I'd like to sort of just ensure that we have chance for Q&A. Just a couple of examples of roadmaps. So we've got just to pull out for sort of reference for people. So there's looking at, for example, Thailand and the Philippines have recently issued roadmaps or draft roadmaps, both of which are quite industry-led. So looking at actually how e-mobility, but the deployment of e-mobility in the real world can actually support their industrial development ambitions in key sectors. So those are both out there. India is a really interesting example of where you have a national level mission plan and then state level roadmaps, and that's sort of taking into account a very diverse picture for e-mobility by state, depending on how they'll be affected, right the way through from energy and sort of extractive industries, right the way through to urban mobility and then also manufacturing. We've got a public transport focus roadmap in the Philippines, which was a different one, focused just on the public transport sector. And then, as mentioned at the beginning, I'm working on one in Mongolia, which has become very energy sector focused, just because of the energy intensity or the carbon intensity of energy there. And the challenge becomes very much focused on that. Key tips: keep it focused. So the purpose is to inspire, give direction, and identify the big ticket items and resolve the key barriers. So we don't need to be exhaustive, but we do need to make sure that we create a path forward which can overcome the main barriers, and that we have sufficient buy-in to the different actions at the time. Keep it ambitious, but we also need to keep it realistic. So it's a coordinated package of actions. If we depart from what is deliverable, then it can have consequences elsewhere on other actions. You should be flexible to respond to the findings of the exploratory assessment. So we need to really understand the concept, the context, before we start defining things in too much detail. And we need to link incentives. So if we're going to provide particularly fiscal ones to the barriers that they're designed to solve. And I think when we come to looking at financing in the Ministry of Finance, there needs to be a compelling case for why we propose certain types of incentives or actions over others, to make sure that we're getting best public sector value for money out of whatever incentives we're looking at providing. So that was a very quick overview of roadmaps, and I think just within time. I'll open up the floor at this point to any questions which people might have. Yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Stuart. I thought that was a really good sort of articulation of roadmaps in that framework context, and I know that that roadmaps at our recent workshop in Seoul, and that I know some of our attendees participated in, was an area of significant interest. I see we've got a few hands going up, so I'll endeavour to bring people in. Nailin, I'll open your mic. If you've got a question, I'll allow you to pose it to Stuart. Please go ahead.
All right, so sorry about that.
No worries at all. Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
No, I'm so sorry. I pressed the hand by mistake. So sorry about that.
Oh no, it wasn't a question. It was a rogue hand. No problem at all. Thank you for your honesty. Robert Kang.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon. This is my second time attending the webinar, and since our speaker have been part of studying the possibility of e-mobility in the Philippines, especially for public transport, our government is now gearing for putting new modern public transport. How are you seeing our government direction?
Okay, so I mean, on that one, I can respond, I suppose, to where it was when I was working on the public transport roadmap, and I think that was very much focused on so there's a very strong industrial development focus, and that was one of the key things that we had to respond to after that initial exploratory assessment. Was sort of saying, actually, we can look at the public transport almost like as a transport planning and energy issue, but actually the real driver here is industrial development. So that, for us, I think the result was the focus of the incentives for the jeepney sector, particularly the e-jeepney sector, focused around national production and stimulating national industry around the e-jeepney, which has now gone into into service and is being operated, I believe, in Davao, with less focus perhaps on areas where there was less readiness for national production, looking at, for example, buses and looking at 12-meter buses, particularly, which are quite niche in the Philippines. So it was very much, I think it was very much focused. It was an industrial focused roadmap, which seems to be moving forward in terms of the implementation of that key sector. I'm aware now that there is the CREVI, which has been developed by DTI, so the Department for Trade and Investment, which looks at more broadly at e-mobility, which I'm not as familiar with, I'm afraid, but it appears to be moving forward in terms of deployment, and it's taken on quite significant momentum.
Yeah, because in southern part of Davao, in General Santos City, where we operated our electric jeeps, we have already almost 100 units running the streets of General Santos City, and we are looking forward because in the Asian region, I think boldly the Philippines is the only country making a hard decision on changing our old traditional public transport into modern one. One of that would be electric jeeps or buses. So
Yeah.
I believe Davao has already been acquiring loans from ADB, and that's why we need help. If we rely on the national government funding for acquisition of electric vehicles, that it will take us long, and we believe other international organizations are looking in the Philippines for us to be able to transition into greener public transport.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's absolutely the role for the financing doesn't necessarily government involvement doesn't always involve financing or national government. I think the one, so there's absolutely a role for international financing. I think the challenge we found with, or the thing we were looking at in the Philippines, was how the national sort of franchising model for public transport, how that might need adjustment, or how suitable that was for promoting e-mobility in a context where actually the investment cost tends to get borne by individual operators. So I think there's a role for everyone. Yeah, I would definitely agree.
Actually, for now, the national government, especially the franchising authority, is now encouraging transport operators to consider or to dedicate green routes. So in our case, General Santos City, we are accommodating more than almost 10 routes for electric vehicle.
Oh, excellent. That's it's good to hear that there's the actual implementation of these things on the ground. So no, thank you for sharing.
That's our way to have e-mobility more faster be implemented.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. It's finding those business models or the regulatory models to enable that to happen, isn't it?
Thank you so much, Robert. I'm just conscious of time a little bit, and the need to maybe ask if anybody else has any questions they'd like to pose. I know, Stuart, you've got a hard stop with us today, so we've got to get away. So if there are any further questions, please feel free to pose them. I can't see anything in the Q&A at this time. Okay, no, maybe not. Okay, well, in that case, we'll wrap it up for the day. Stuart, first of all, Stuart, thank you very much for joining us today and for sharing your insights on the EV roadmap development process, and to all of our participants for joining. As Jiwoon mentioned at the top of the webinar, this is the final one in the series. So please stand by. We'll be sharing a new series for the new year in due course. But otherwise, I'd just like to thank you and thank all of our speakers indeed for presenting over the course of Series 1, and we look forward to more engagement in the new year. Wish you all the best with your days and your weeks ahead, and look forward to catching up soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. See you next year.